G'day, this is Barney here, and I have our special guest from Canada, Wallace Clink. Welcome, Wallace.
Barney, very good to see you.
No worries. Now I know your pet subject for today. It's a big subject. It's called the price system. The price system, and well, I got to be a bit honest with this one, Wallace. I'm not sure even where to start, so I'm going to actually let you. I'm going to let you have the floor and open it up and see if I can keep up with you. So go right ahead.
Well, I don't know where to start either exactly, Barney, but I think a lot of people don't. The problem is a lot of people, when they think about things, if they do think, they jump in the middle rather than starting from the ground and working up.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I think that it's important when you're thinking about economics and that sort of thing that you do start from the very, very base. And the price system is the base.
Okay. Yep. Yep.
We engage in economics and we produce things. And what we do actually, people have to understand firstly that money doesn't grow on trees or drop from heaven. It is created, and it is created by the process of the banks creating credit and lending it, not lending deposits, existing deposits. The
Just
banks
ha- just
create the credit.
just hang on a sec here, Wallace.
Hmm.
Just take one step back from what you just said.
Yes,
You said that the banks create credit and that's not actually a process of lending someone else's money. Just explain that a bit further for me, please.
no, and that was made very clear by, I believe, the Bank of Canada's uh, head some years ago in a hearing. He
Hmm.
said that lending deposits is not the business of banking. Banks are in the business of creating credit, and that is the way our money comes into being. When they lend money, they create it first, and then
Hmm.
they lend it, and it becomes a deposit. The deposit follows the loan, and so that the banks really are the source of our money. For all practical purposes.
So,
Most of our,
so just let me just work with that a little bit further.
sure.
So banks create credit
Yes,
and then they issue that credit in the form of loans. And so when we see, like in Australia, we see an expansion of the money supply. That's
yes,
actually an expansion of the loans or an expansion of the indebtedness of either the government or the
that's right.
community.
That is right, because the banks have created that and it has become used as our money, but it has a very short lifespan because what happens was if you want to engage in production,
Mm-hmm.
you have to access resources, and by that I mean real resources, physical resources from the community, labor.
Mm-hmm.
You have to expertise, you have to access materials and equipment and that sort of thing. So what you do is you present a business plan and you apply to a banking institution for financing, and they will create the money which allows you to obtain those things.
Mm.
Now, in doing that, you have incurred a cost, a financial cost, and that cost has to be reimbursed. You have to recover your costs. And the only way you can recover your costs is through sales. In other words, the final end of production is consumption, and it is the consumer in making his purchase,
Mm-hmm.
passing the money back through the system that you're able to reimburse your bank
Mm.
for your production loan and to qualify for a renewal of that so that you can continue producing goods and services for the community.
I find that interesting because I've actually been around people where the chief financial officer
Hmm.
has had to approach different banks, and I know at one stage they actually even went overseas. They went to Europe, and
Right.
they put a something out on the financial market where the banks in Europe could actually tender to take on this package and finance the company for a year. And I
Hmm.
think that the numbers they were talking were about 1,000 million Australian dollars. And so the company was actually borrowing 1,000 million equivalent Australian dollars for them to produce what they were producing over the next year, and that was their working capital, if you like. It was like
Hmm.
I remember one of the managers referred to it as essentially a credit card.
That's right.
The chief financial officer had been issued by the banks in Europe a credit card to the tune of $1,000 million, and that had to be processed over the next 12 months. And that means that they could use the funds and they could execute the programs of getting raw materials and producing goods and services, sending it out into the market, and then the market had to return that money plus profit back to the coffers of the company. And they had to
So we,
maintain that it was viable. And so at the end of the year, they could again apply for another extension of that credit or further extension.
and the viability.
Is that what you're talking about? You're talking about
Yes,
the operating capital, and the banks are actually issuing that, and it's an expansion of new money, and it's not actually deposits at all. It's actually a creation of the banks. So just clarify for me, Wallace.
there's
Wait,
a running credit with a bank, which allows you to make purchases to engage in your particular enterprise,
hmm
to obtain the things you need in order to proceed with the production of goods and services.
Now you
And
touched on a couple of things that I'm gonna go on left field here because there's this all these questions in my mind. One is, what do the banks actually put up as collateral in order to issue the new money? What do the banks actually put up? I know what the company puts up. It puts up all its infrastructure, all its industry, all its assets, all its raw materials, and all that. The company puts that up and is mortgaged for that. But in order for the banks to issue the credit, what do the banks actually put up?
well, we're getting a little bit ahead maybe of ourselves here, but in fact, the banks don't really put up anything. It's the borrower who puts up the collateral, and the banks have a lien on it.
A
And
lien,
if the
is that a mortgage? Is that a lien? That's what
a
you mean?
mortgage or
A
yes,
mortgage.
a claim on, and if you don't repay the loan, the bank has the option of literally foreclosing upon your real physical assets.
Wow.
Now
Wow.
that certainly raises some questions, some very serious questions, because we have to realize that the bank actually has not created anything in terms of real wealth. But
It's
if
only,
you don't pay them back the money that they have created
mm,
and lent to you, they will seize your real assets. Now
isn't that
that
isn't that
brings
interesting? They create numbers,
mhm,
and it's mortgaged against real assets
that's
and
right.
real wealth that's in the community. All they do is
Now,
create numbers.
and the thing of it is, of course, that it's absolutely essential that money be created for production to take place.
hmm
There's no way around that. That is
mm,
absolutely necessary.
hmm
And what the banks do in providing that service is absolutely critical.
hmm
But it brings up the question of who owns the credit of the community or the banks that issue the money through their loaning activities. Normally, we would start to think in terms of what we regard as counterfeiting, wouldn't we?
Well, you would because they're just writing numbers into a ledger or computer blips or whatever, and the company is putting its heart and soul. I mean, if I was a small company, I might have mortgaged my own home plus the assets that belong to the company that I've got, and all of that blood, sweat, and tears is laid on the line, whereas the bank is only coming up with numbers, and it seems to be that the numbers are honoured one bank to the other bank to the other bank to the other bank. It's a pretty good
Well, yes.
arrangement. Yeah.
What happens is the money is issued, and of course, the money doesn't last very long because the money is borrowed for a purpose,
hmm
and the money is spent.
mm
And when it's spent, it goes directly back to whatever business is involved, and that business will pay off its loan. So the
mm
money is not, it doesn't circulate around the community.
hmm
There's this strange story going around that where somebody arrives in town and they place the money on the counter and they go off to do something. In the meantime, this money passes from all the different vendors in the community and
Hmm.
liquidates all their debt. Well,
Mm.
that, of course, is absolutely ridiculous
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
businesses have costs. And when
Yep.
money goes to a business, it doesn't pass to the next business. It goes back to pay off their loans or replace their capital.
Mm.
And then, of course, they will engage in activities. But that every time they engage in an activity, it creates a new cost.
Mm.
So, in other words, the idea of money increasing its purchasing power by the rapidity of its circulation is absolute superstitious nonsense.
Mm.
It is ridiculous.
Mm. Mm. Okay. Well, all right. We've got it that banks create money. That's one thing. We'll just
They do.
park. We'll park that. But we're talking about the price system, and we're talking about goods and services, real goods and services. And just clarify for me, Wallace, the price system, the construction
Okay.
of it. Yep.
The assumption seems to have been in economics that you have the circular flow of costs and a flow of incomes, and that those balance each other out. Now, of
Mm.
course, this sounds very reasonable, but
Mm.
it doesn't take into the consideration that actually money that is put into circulation is prematurely canceled and will not be available to buy the final product when it is finished.
Mm.
And the reasons for that are somewhat complex or technical, but money is withdrawn to in forms of different forms of saving, including capital accumulation.
Mm-hmm.
And any business has costs. Their costs are labor, and payments made for labor are income in the hands of the people who receive it.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Yep.
no no
Yep.
no
Income. Okay, you spoke about income. I
yeah
understand that. That goes back
notice
into wages so they can spend it on the products that they can make.
that's right.
Yep.
However,
Mm-hmm.
as you and I know, even not being versed in perhaps in the more complex aspects of production, we know that any business has costs which go far and far beyond labor.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm.
those costs are incurred when the business purchases things that have produced in a previous costing cycle. And so that those things brought in and into the business and added to the costs of labor do not distribute income. They do incur a cost and they enter into final prices so that your labor and these other costs are the total amount of costs and the total amount of prices,
Can I
including profit.
can I just touch on that then?
Yeah.
Just for my simple brain,
Mm-hmm.
and that is that if I'm running a business and I sort of allocate or I earmark when I'm doing my accounting, I earmark and I say, righto, I've got so much income, and of that income, because that income comes from sales,
Yes.
and so that income, so much is allocated to wages, and if you like, some of it may go to utilities, and some of it may go to depreciation of fixed equipment,
Mm-hmm.
and some of it may go to mortgage payments. I guess to me, I mean, if I'm running a business, I think the first payment you make is always the mortgage payment, which is otherwise you can't run your business. So that,
That's it.
and you might run your equipment down, and you might run your supplies down. But if you miss out on your mortgage payment, so I understand what you're saying there. That the first thing is that the money's got to go straight back to pay the mortgage, and I guess because the lien on the business, as you call it, the mortgage on the business, is the first priority. That's what they call the first mortgage. So I
Yes.
appreciate that. Okay. And then with the income that's going, okay, I've got so much on capital equipment. I mean, if I was making these, I mean, the picture of this map behind us, then I'd have capital equipment of raw materials like paper or cloth, whatever, ink, a printing machine, whatever it was, all those sorts of things. And so I've got to, and then of course I've got to have an office to work in. So I've got utilities and
Mm-hmm.
furniture, and it all adds up. That, as I understand it, I could be wrong, but I think I'm reasonably close. That say 50 years ago, before robotic automation came in, um, the amount of money that went out in labour, as in wages, dividends, and things like that, was possibly around 50%. But now
Yeah,
with automation, robotics, and of course the industrialization, it's getting less and less. And now I understand it's even less than 40%. So when we produce things, even less than 40% of it is all that's there to go out into the community to buy. Think about this, Wallace, to buy what we make. As a community, we can only buy less than 40% of what we make. And that to me is a hang on a sec. If this I think you mentioned Say's law before that there's the equivalent amount goes in spending power as goes into prices. Well, hang on a sec. If it's less than 40%, Say's law doesn't hold. That's all nonsense. And so what we've got to look at is, well, how does the community then offset that other 60%? Just,
that's the
yep,
problem.
yep.
Yeah, and you see, Arnie, what they offset it by borrowing more money. The consumer borrows money to make up the difference,
Mm,
his shortfall of income relative to total prices. He borrows money to make up the difference.
hmm
Or we have further money issued as debt for further production so that that new production can liberate new incomes, which will then go back and buy the earlier goods. But when the goods that they're currently working on
hmm
are finished, the money will no longer be available because it will have been spent on the past goods and it will have gone back to the system through the business and cancel its the business costs in terms of its bank loan or its withdrawal from capital, so that it won't become income again until it is issued for new production, which has a whole new and additional set of costs. So what we have is we have a flow picture of the economy. We have a flow of incomes and we have a flow of costs. And the costs are running more and more ahead of the incomes.
That's
Now,
right.
obviously, that wouldn't work because it couldn't work if business has to recover its costs
hmm
from sales,
Mm,
and the consumer doesn't have enough money to buy, well, then obviously the whole thing is going to fall flat. So it runs on a mortgage on the future. People
mm,
borrow money from the banks,
mm,
and that money doesn't circulate around. It is spent on something, and it goes straight back to the business, and it's canceled out of existence.
mm,
It doesn't circulate around the community.
mm.
So in any case, and this is the way the system runs. It runs on debt, and because it runs on debt, and people are able to buy through the process of mortgaging their future or expending all sorts of useless effort, very often useless effort, and actually very very undesirable effort in terms of the means of destruction, such as war armaments and that sort of thing, which
hmm
distribute lots of income.
mm.
But what we're doing is we're living by drawing on the future.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
I'm starting to see that, Wallace. I'm starting to see that the actual, if we look at a cycle of production,
mhm,
and at the end of, say, the week, we produce what we do, and I put my hand out and say, okay, well, there's my hand, and I get my wages. But the
mhm,
thing is that what I've been involved in producing that week hasn't even reached the marketplace yet, and
mhm.
what I'm doing is I'm buying what was produced a week, a month, or a year ago. And
Yeah,
and
it's
so
almost
and
as
so I spend that week's wages, and the fact is that there's all that production coming up from behind, that might have been produced a week, a month, or a year ago that still hasn't even got any spending power associated with it. So of course we've got to borrow more
that's
money, and
that's
that
right.
that explains the debt clock. Why? I mean,
Mhm.
this is to me this is something we've got to think about in our sort of mind's eye here.
But
Is is
if the economists think that the system is balanced, it's only because we're borrowing money against the future, which is flowing in to meet the costs of these goods that we otherwise would not be able to buy.
yeah.
And and it's almost as though I were to go around the community. If I say I earn $40,000 a year
Hmm.
and I borrowed 20, that I went around the community saying that I earn $60,000 a year.
Hmm.
Now
Hmm.
you can see the absurdity of that,
That's right.
because I now have an obligation that I have to collect from the future, and
hmm
that will go into future prices.
That means I've got to work next year to cover what I've purchased today that's already been produced. That's what
And
you're
you see,
saying. Yeah.
yeah, and the fundamental
Yeah.
thing here is, you see, the thing of it is, Arnie, or Barney, we have, we have, we have, we, as organisms, we engage in activities. We can't produce and consume in a complicated modern economy without having some way of organizing ourselves in a rational fashion. So we have invented what we call money.
hmm
There is no reason in the world to assume that the system we have invented to represent our economic activities is necessarily a proper and correct representation of those activities. We assume that it is without thinking. Most people do. They just carry
Mm,
on blindly
mm,
ahead.
mm,
I think we
mm.
have to go back again to the ground level and say, I wonder if the system we're using really does reflect the reality of what we're doing. Because if you think about it, if you're producing something and you just forget about money altogether and you think about what you're doing,
Mm,
you're applying energy to materials in order to convert them to usable form,
hmm
right?
Yep, yep.
I see your eyes came on with a
Well,
sudden
well, they did
recognition.
because yeah. If we forget about money and just think about what we're actually doing,
Yes, the
yeah,
true.
yeah,
What is it? What is the true cost then of producing what we produce? It's the amount of energy that we consume, human energy, non-human energy, and materials. And when we are finished, saying that we're not using money, when we're finished producing something, we have already provided all the real costs of that production.
Okay, I'm going to give an illustration here because I'm out in the
Sure.
paddock a fair bit, and I
Mm-hmm.
noticed that the paddock next door, the farmer plants some grain, and then the rains come. I mean, he prepares the field, he plants the grain, the rains come, and there's a natural increase, and then he harvests the grain and he cuts the straw down and he bales it, and then that's ready for market. The grain's ready for market, and so is the straw. And then the cycle starts again. He might fertilize, etc., etc. The point is, what you're saying is that when he's finished harvesting, the real cost of production is is finished.
It's
And
finished.
and the fact is that with the grain, it doesn't matter whether it's grain or it's straw or it's a car or it's a house or whatever. The real cost, once it's finished, is paid. And so there's no debt in that. Now, I understand that if the financial system was balanced, then there'd have to be an equal amount of spending power in the community to buy what the farmer had just produced. Now
Absolutely.
that's providing the farmer doesn't overproduce. Because I mean, if he continues to make grain and grain and grain, and the silos are full, I mean, well, have a year off, you know. But if the
That's
silos,
right. But
if the
it would be
silos are,
psychotic. It would be
that's right.
psychotic
Yeah,
to go on producing things when nobody wants them. That'd be
yeah.
a total waste of time on the part of the producer, and it just doesn't make sense.
No, no, that's right. So, and obviously, all right, there's a waste there is overproduction, but I understand there's also a waste in obsolescence. Obsolescence.
Yes, that's another factor.
And that is essentially that and I found it was interesting. You look at my hoofs, and there was a particular type of boot that I saw bought, and it actually had a limited shelf life because the sole, get this, Wallace, the sole on the boot would dissolve on the shelf. So
Well, in
over a period of time, if you hadn't soled the boots, they rotted. And I thought, hang on a sec, well, that's what you call obsolescence. So that forces you to just have production and then destroy your own production. And that's what you talk about, the destructive thing that's going on because
it's waste.
it's a waste. It's an
In
absolute
other words,
waste.
in this world, don't store up too many treasures on Earth where things rust and corrode
Mm,
and so on.
hmm mm. But I'm pretty sure that the old style boots, I mean, I know a bloke pretty close to home. and he had a pair of pajamas given to him,
Hmm.
and they were issued by the Australian Commonwealth Clothing Factory. I think that's what it was called. Now those
Hmm.
pajamas were 25 years old, and he was still wearing them. And I used to smile at that because I thought, well, there you go. And nowadays, of course, you might buy an item of clothing and there's no way, Jose, you're going to get 25 years out of them. I'm a sort of a rotundus type of bloke, and I don't mind wearing a bit of overalls and that, but I'm only getting 2 or 3 years out of a pair of overalls, and they rot.
No.
They rot. They actually dissolve from the
Mm.
washing. And we use some pretty mild detergents, so it's not the detergents. It's actually the way the clothing is manufactured. It's designed to rot, and that to me is destructive waste.
Well, it's true that if, I mean, the thing of it is, we can all choose. In a free society, we can choose what we want to use and how long we want to use it, how
Mm,
long we regard it as desirable or functional or whatever. But what we're concerned about here is the ability to acquire it in the first place when it is produced.
hmm
And that is the important thing. So, in a no money society, you would have production taking place and things would be produced. They would be paid for completely. And I guess the society would simply share what was produced.
Okay.
But
Um,
because
what you're saying, what you're implying then, if the society shares what they're producing, is that there is actually there's a right, there's a claim for every individual. If because of what? Automatics, because of robotics, because of the natural resources of the world, they actually belong to the communities that produce them. Is that what you're implying?
that is the rub on it. We have a rule, sort of an imperative, a moral imperative that one should obtain nothing unless one works for it. That is a supreme misconception of the reality of things
Mm,
because nature itself provides much of what we have
mm-hmm,
as materials and so on to use for production. Automation, which is actually the realization of efficiency,
mm-hmm,
uh, produces a vast majority of what we actually produce.
mm-hmm,
In America, in the 1800s, the early 1800s, 75% of the economy was devoted to the mere production of food. Today, I think it
75%.
is, well, I think today it's less than 4%, possibly
Mm,
3.
mm,
So, I mean, you show, and that's not just a slight change, that is an order
colossal.
of magnitude that is really enormous.
Mm,
And so, I mean, the thing of it is, we as human beings are only so efficient. In fact, we have a very limited efficiency as an organism because we have only so much energy and so much strength.
mm-hmm,
And it doesn't really vary very much. It doesn't increase as we, in fact, it decreases as we get older. But we have developed, human beings are different in this sense. Animals have access to their needs primarily.
mm-hmm,
Birds build nests and beavers build dams, but generally speaking, nature, it simply derives its means of sustenance from its environment.
mm-hmm,
And you know, we are part of nature itself. We can't divorce ourselves from nature. We are organisms which, however, have been blessed with certain mental faculties which have allowed us to develop tools
mm-hmm,
where we achieve a greater efficiency
mm-hmm,
and we can replace our direct energy with the use of these more efficient tools, which
mm-hmm,
get better and better and better as time goes on and become part of our cultural heritage, which we
mm,
pass on from generation to generation.
mm-hmm.
And we build upon that heritage, and that is what allows us to have a better standard of living as we move on.
That's very important, Wallace. I'm just going to, because I'm aware of the time, I'm just going to do a quick summary of the most salient points that I see.
Mhm.
And it's to do with the numbers that you've actually come up with. 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 75% of the population was involved in producing food. Okay?
Right?
75% of the population. Now we're less than 4%. Okay? So that's like, if it was 5%, you call it, say, 1/15th or whatever it is of, right? So 1/15th or 6% of the population of the workforce is producing. historically is today producing equivalent to what was being produced 150 years ago. So of that very small percentage, we don't actually have, we don't actually issue with the crop, we don't actually issue sufficient purchasing power so that we can actually enjoy the benefit of what those food producers produce. We don't
Yes,
actually, and that's the point. That's the salient point that's in the price system. The issue that's in the price system is that there is insufficient spending power for the community to buy what the community can actually make. What that small percentage of the community can now make, whereas virtually everyone used to be involved in making, and now just a small percentage does. And of course, the wages for that, what did you say, 4%? Less than 4% are involved in food production. The wages of that 4% is miles insufficient for us to actually buy what's being made. It's
that is
it's
true.
it's completely disproportionate, isn't it?
Well, and the problem is, Arnie, is we are basically it's like this. We are not allowed to live with what we've already produced, even if we consider it as sufficient. We cannot acquire it until we produce something more. And
Mm,
because of the defect in the price system, where labor is replaced more and more by non-labor factors, this gap between incomes and prices becomes greater and greater and greater, which means that we have to engage in more and more and more and more future activities in order to obtain what we produced in the past. Well, you
mm,
can see we're on a treadmill and we're running faster and faster and faster
that's right.
and falling behind all the time.
Mm,
Now we have to stop and ask ourselves, what is the purpose of life? Is the purpose of life nothing but economic commercial activity?
mm,
No, surely to goodness, life. We should have an opportunity for leisure where we can develop a more cultured and enriched society,
mm,
where we can literally have time to think,
mm,
time to enjoy.
mm,
Because what's the point in producing things if you can't enjoy them?
mm.
And if you have to do more and more and more work to enjoy what you produced in the past, you don't have time to enjoy those things
Well,
to a large extent.
isn't that
So
true? I mean, I'm looking at the newspapers that are going on around the world, and I see that nation is invading nation in order to pilfer the raw materials off that nation, and so they're more or less stealing from their neighbour in order to balance their own books, and what they're delivering in exchange for those raw materials is other goods and services that are surplus to them in the name of in the description of bombs and rockets and missiles and all that sort of stuff, which of course is absurd.
it,
It's
it
absurd.
distributes lots of incomes, but does it distribute a quality of life?
No, absolutely not. So trying to balance the books using the existing system is a form of insanity, isn't it?
Well, it's a form of worship of work. Work. The purpose of work is to get a result. It's not to produce more work. That is really quite an insane conception,
Mm,
because you're trying to achieve something. When you achieve it, you want to enjoy it. You
mm,
don't want it to just be a burden upon you so that you have to do more in
mm,
order to enjoy it, which
mm-hmm,
prevents you from enjoying it.
mm,
I mean, it shows you, and it's because we have a wrong, actually an immoral concept of the basis of the individual's right to partake of the production that emanates from the productive system.
mm,
Everyone has a right in consumption because everyone, there's no point in producing it if you can't sell it. And if you can't sell it, you can't remain in business.
mm,
So if you do produce it and it's available, and you can acquire only a certain amount with your income, the rest you can't, then
mm-hmm,
you have to devise the means for distributing the balance.
mm. That's right.
Because
And it seems to, in my mind, we've got this production sorted in the sense we've got robotics and automation, advanced control. So we've got production sorted to a high degree, and we've got this consumption sorted because we've got all the shops and the supermarkets and the tele advertising mail order and all the big distributors and all that sort of stuff. So we've got consumption organized. But what we haven't got is we haven't got a balanced system of distribution. That to me is what's apparent in my mind. And that balance, if we just talk about food, just break it up into a component part. Don't talk about all the high fidelity everythings and the fancy everythings. Just let's talk about food. And if we've got less than 4% of the population producing all the food we need, then there's got to be a method of distribution. There's got to be a method that allows each member of society access to a sufficiency of that food that they can live.
Now,
And that's,
money,
yep,
yeah, money is a claim check. That's basically what it is. It's a ticket that gives you access to make
hmm
a claim on
yep,
something.
yep,
Now, the thing of it is, the banks create that today and record it as a debt owing to themselves.
hmm
The money has to be created. It should be created because we should create things for people and
hmm
they should be able to use them. But we
hmm
shouldn't have to mortgage our future in order to do it. And
mm,
we shouldn't give someone else the right to foreclose on our assets if we don't pay them
mm,
when the physical assets have been paid for
hmm
through the act of production.
mm,
So with the new money is being created by the banks, but it's being done as a mortgage on our future, an inflationary mortgage.
hmm
It should be created, but it should be created without debt to
hmm
fill the balance,
hmm
to facilitate consumption of everything that is being produced. So
mm,
that with our earned incomes, which are decreasing, and the new money being created, we can access the entire amount of production in each production and costing cycle.
mm. I remember hearing it said, they talked about a train system, and a train system essentially represents all the infrastructure and technology and know-how that's in front of us. And so you've got these trains and they come and they go, and there's hundreds and thousands of them all over the place. And you've got all of the laying of the tracks, and you've got the train stations and the boom gates and all that sort of stuff. And you've got all the people who want access to the train. And the problem is, what's the problem, Wallace? The ticket system.
The
There's
ticket system,
there's
yes,
not
that's
enough there's not enough tickets.
right.
And here it is, an absolute gobsmacked abundance of everything. There it is. We're just so industrialized. We've got so much that only a small percentage of the population is needed to produce everything. And we've got all the know-how, the infrastructure, the technologies all there, raw materials, the whole lot. And what we're short of is giving out tickets.
In
And
other
and
words, money is simply accountancy.
yeah,
And money is today regarded as a commodity to be traded, to be
mm,
bought and sold and traded.
that's where
But
we're
the thing of it,
confused, isn't it? We're confused
yes,
that money itself is really it's numbers on a ledger.
yeah.
And
It,
we treat it as something that's, hang on, I need my numbers. My numbers have to be in the black, your numbers in the red, and we sort of hold them. It's almost like a religious zeal, isn't it?
well, it is. And the thing of it is, why is money a commodity to be traded? A commodity to be traded is a scarce commodity.
Mm,
It's because money is maintained in scarce supply relative to its requirement to liquidate the costs of production.
hmm
And so that therefore the people who have the monopoly of creating it are able to treat it as a commodity.
mm,
But really, it's just a method of accounting our activities. It is a system of accountancy, and it should be issued for production and recovered in the act of consumption
Well, you've certainly shown me, Wallace, that we need to rethink this whole thing. We need to
from the ground up.
from the ground up. That's right. We need to rethink, and we need to design a money system that is actually going to achieve an equilibrium between production and consumption so
And
that
costs.
obviously so that the
Yeah.
costs are met so that those that are producing, as long as the market wants what the producer is producing, those that are producing are paid, and they can liquidate their debts that go with it, and that the community is able to access it in a reasonable manner, so a sufficient manner that
Right.
they've got. Yeah.
Today, if I borrow money for a car, the money is almost It's almost non-existent in the terms of time because it goes from my account to the vendor and it goes back to the producer and it's canceled.
Mm,
But now, are the costs of production canceled? No. I
mm,
now have a debt
mm,
and I have to charge that against future production.
mm, That's right. It's all skew if. It's all skew if.
So it's not they're not canceled. They're merely transferred.
Mm, yeah,
And
that's
now we
right.
have 240 or 50 trillion dollars, the estimate, of debt outstanding. Well, what is that debt? That debt represents unliquidated financial costs.
Yes, that's right. Unliquidated financial costs that actually, if we had a fair and equitable system, would have already been distributed into the community so that the costs could be liquidated. I'm starting to see the picture, Wallace. And this has been a bit of a brain strain, so I'm gonna pull us up now. But it's been wonderful talking to you, and I'd like to do it again soon. So thank you so much for joining us, Wallace.
Certainly, Bonnie, I've enjoyed the discussion very much. It's close to my heart, and I think it's very, very essential to the survival of our civilization,
Mm.
actually.
Very important discussion. No worries. Thank you very much, Wallace. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be bringing Wallace back soon enough, and I hope you enjoyed today's forum. Cheers.